Hello. In this session we're going to look at the user clause of a commercial property lease, and in particular what this means in relation to businesses' use of leasehold property. Here you have an example of typical wording that you might find in a commercial property lease. So first of all it says not to use the demised premises otherwise than for light industrial purposes. And then you might find wording to the effect of not to change the use without the landlord's prior written consent. So what does that mean, and what else might you find in the user clause of a lease, and how does it impact on businesses' use of property? So a user clause in a lease specifies what the demised premises, i.e. the property that's been leased to the tenant, can or cannot be used for. It might be quite specific and say to be used as an office or a shop. Might actually refer to planning legislation to be used for A1 purposes or B1 purposes. Those come from the Town and Country Planning Act's use classes order. Maybe even more specific than that and specify a type of retail use. So it may, for example, say something like to be used as a retail shop for the sale of high-class ladies' fashion wear. And only by reading the lease can you see whether it's that specific or whether it's a little bit broader and just referring generally to retail use, for example. There may be positive clauses, so to use for, but equally there may be negative clauses, not to use for. I've seen this, for example, in premises leased by the Church Commission, where it's specific about what the property can be used for, but also what it cannot be used for. In that instance, it was not to be used for gambling purposes, the sale of alcohol, the sale of tobacco, which was very much against the principles of the Church Commission. So again, by reading the lease, you'll see whether it specifies what you can, but also specifies what you cannot use it for. So, why might a landlord wish to restrict how the premises can be used? What I'd like you to do here is pause the presentation and just for a few minutes give some thought to that question and jot down any notes or thoughts that you might have. Okay, thank you for rejoining. So, what did you note down? What were your thoughts? These are just some of the reasons why a landlord might want to restrict the user. So I'll go through these examples. One might be an estate management consideration by the landlord. So the landlord might actually own a series of properties on a site. So the photograph shown is a retail shop. So the landlord might own a whole development. It might be a suburban shopping precinct. And they will be concerned with ensuring you've got a good tenant mix in that precinct, because what you don't want is a whole row of bakers or butchers or off licenses. You want to ensure that you've got a mix that will attract as many customers in there as possible, which will mean that ingoing tenants will want to be located there, so they'll be prepared to pay a good rent for that, which will in turn mean that the value of that landlord's investment is maximised. So there may be considerations around ensuring that you've got a mix of appropriate trades that will meet the broad needs of the public there. And that is very typical with shopping precincts. It's about maintaining that mix. So the user clause in that instance might say not to use for a use that would conflict with one of the other users of the development within the landlord's ownership. So it is about maintaining value as well. So again, the landlord might want to restrict uses at a property that could have a depressing effect on the value. This one also links to insurance implications, but typically industrial estates, there are certain uses that landlords shy away from because it can have a negative impact on the value, such as vehicle repairs. Typically vehicle repair workshops, so there's lots of mess, there's lots of parts outside, oil. It can be quite a messy use, and that can have an impact on the lettability of the landlord's other units in that development. So that might be a use that the landlord wants to kind of steer clear of, because it can have that depressing effect on the value of their investment. Similarly, as I say, that links with insurance implications. As there are certain uses that will have an effect on the premium, may increase the premium because it may carry greater risk. Now, that isn't normally a problem because the landlord under a full repairing and insuring lease would pass on the cost of the insurance to the tenant, but it could have an impact on the premium for adjoining properties within the landlord's ownership. And again, a landlord will be very conscious of that. From a tenant's viewpoint, it's about planning for the future. So if you are signing up to a lease that has a user clause that is quite restrictive, that may not allow for flexibility in how the business develops and uses that property as you move into the future. So it might be when you take out a lease, you're very clear that the business is X, but as the business matures, it might want to diversify and be in the business of X and Y. Now, if the lease allows that, that's fine, but if it's quite a restrictive user clause in the lease, then that could be problematic for the business. So from the tenant's viewpoint, it's about being proactive and planning for the future and anticipating what future uses might we need to put the property to, and therefore can we ensure when the lease is drawn up at the outset that that flexibility is built into the lease. An interesting example that I dealt with was it was a long lease, so it was a lease for 25 years. That one of the major supermarket chains took many years ago, so it was getting towards the end of the lease. Now, supermarkets 25 years ago were very different to what they're like today. You think about supermarkets now, they will sell lottery tickets, they will have their own bakery, they will sell alcohol, they will sell garden furniture, they will sell pretty much everything. Now, in the instance of the property and the lease that I was dealing with, it was a lease that was granted quite some time ago, and it didn't allow for a number of those items to be sold. So that was quite restrictive for the business. So the business had changed, but the lease didn't allow that flexibility. What happened in that instance was that we had to renegotiate the lease with the landlord so that we could build in more flexibility to allow the diversification of sales from that particular property, and that had financial kind of implications. So it is very much about control of the landlord, so making sure that what the property is used for doesn't have a negative impact on the value of their investment, versus flexibility for the tenant, so planning ahead for the business so that we're not constrained in terms of what we can do from that property within the business. There can be other reasons for restrictions in a user clause. So, for example, it may be if your business leases the property from a landlord, they might not actually own the property freehold. They might have a long lease on the property. We talked about long leases earlier in the introductory session. So they may have taken a long lease on the land and then constructed a building on it, which they've subsequently leased out to your business. If they have a long lease, there may be restrictions in that long lease on what the property or the site can be used for, and they would naturally replicate those restrictions in the lease that they've granted to the occupying tenant. Just as equally, there may be restrictions in the freehold title. So if the landlord does own the property freehold, there may be certain restrictions that a previous owner has put on the property that they then pass on through the terms of the lease. We of course have planning restrictions. I've referred to the use classes order. The use classes order is referred to in your pre-course material, so you will have that available to you. Planning consent will be being granted for construction of the property, and that will have a use. That's within that planning consent. Historically, if there wasn't specific use referred to, then there will always be a development plan for every area which will zone the location for a particular use. So there will be restrictions in planning terms on what a property can be used for, and that might be referred to in the user clause of the lease. So I talked about earlier, it might say to use for A1 retail purposes. That is the planning use for the property. Now, interestingly, if the use is not specified, so the use isn't specified in the user clause, then there's no other restriction on use other than the legal statutory obligations. So it would default back to the planning use and any kind of other legal and statutory obligations or restrictions. So, for example, if it's in a conservation area, that would restrict what you could use the property for. Now, just in terms of the clauses, these are kind of legal terms that are used. You can have an absolute restriction. So the lease might specify what the property can be used for, and then have the words "and for no other purpose." So it might say for sale of ladies' high-class fashion goods and for no other purpose. Now, in that instance, if the tenant wants to use it for another purpose, then it would be down to negotiating with the landlord. The landlord would not be required to consent to what you want to use it for. But if they do consent, then that would require an amendment to the lease. So that would normally be dealt with by the lawyers by a deed of variation. So it can be, the user can be changed even if it's an absolute restriction, but that's wholly dependent on whether the landlord's prepared to consent to that. Now, the other type of restriction is a qualified restriction. This is much more normal, that it would specify the use and then say, and not without the landlord's prior written consent to use for any other use. And in that instance, again, it's at the landlord's discretion, but subject to the test of reasonableness. And that's something that we would default to case law. So any cases that have gone to court over the landlord refusing to grant consent. So it's all down to this test of reasonableness, which is where the lawyers get heavily involved. Interesting point to note, under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, section 19.3, the landlord is not able to charge a sum of money for granting consent to change of use to a tenant. That's an interesting one. Unscrupulous landlords in the past that I've had the pleasure of dealing with have tried to do that, but the legislation says that a landlord cannot consent to cannot charge for consenting to a change of use. So do be aware of that. If the landlord says yes, we'll agree to that, but you have to pay us £5,000. Okay, so that was fairly short and sweet. So user is something quite easy to get to grips with. Make sure that for every leasehold property that you're responsible for, you understand exactly what the user clause says. So what can you use it for? Does it say what you can't use it for? And what does it say about changing use? So if you do want to change use, can you, and always you should seek approval of the landlord to get consent and have that consent legally documented. That's the end of this session.